There are moments in life when nothing around us has changed, and yet something inside us quietly begins asking different questions. Questions we are too busy to hear before, and sometimes those questions have the power to change the way we see our entire life. Hello, and welcome back to From the Therapy Room Psychology of Mind and Body, understanding how we think, feel, pattern, and become. I'm your host, Jyoti, a clinical counseling psychotherapist. I'm really glad you're here. You're welcome to follow this space and stay connected. This is a space where we pause, reflect, and gently explore the inner landscape of human mind, where psychology meets lived experiences and where the stories we carry inside finally find language. And today I would like to sit with the question that, if we are honest, most of us have wondered at some point. What if the life you're living isn't the life you consciously choose? Have you ever looked around your life? Looked at your job, your relationship, your daily routine, the city you live in, the people around you, and had this strange, almost frightening thought: how did I get here? Not because your life is bad, not because you're ungrateful, not because you have failed, but because something inside you quietly whispers, I don't remember choosing any of this. Sometimes people came into therapy believing they have anxiety or burnout or depression or relationship problem, but as we begin talking, something much deeper slowly emerges. It's not just that they are exhausted, it's that they are living a life built almost entirely around other people's expectations. And somewhere, without even realizing it, they disappeared. I don't mean disappeared physically, I mean psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. The real self become quieter, while another self, the one that knew how to survive, slowly took over. I want you to notice something. Very few people wake up one morning and consciously decide, I want to abandon myself. Nobody does that. Instead, it happens slowly, one small adaptation at a time. When you are 6, you notice your parents smile more when you're obedient, so you become obedient. When you are 8, you learn that crying makes people uncomfortable, so you stop crying. When you're 12, you realize being perfect gets you attention, so perfection becomes your identity. When you're 15, you discover your family only celebrates certain careers, so you stop asking what you actually love. And by the time you are 35, everyone applauds the person you have become, except one person, and that is you. And the strangest part is that you don't even know who you have lost because you have been this version of yourself for so long. So, this episode isn't about blaming your parents. It isn't about rejecting your culture. It isn't about running away from your responsibilities. It's about something much more deeper. It's about being curious, curious enough to ask which part of me were chosen and which part were conditioned. Because here's something psychology has taught us: the children don't choose who they become, children choose who they need to become. So, to stay emotionally safe. And sometimes those childhood survival strategies become adult personalities. Today, I want to explore something together, not with judgment, not with criticism, but with compassion. Because maybe the life you are living isn't wrong. Maybe it simply began as survival and now it's waiting to become a choice. Have you ever wondered when exactly your life became yours? Not legally, not biologically. I mean, when did you actually begin making choices that came from you? Because if we are honest, most of us don't begin life by choosing, we begin life by learning. Learning what earns a smile, learning what disappoints people, learning when to stay quiet, learning when to speak, learning what makes us lovable. And without noticing, those lessons quietly becomes our personality. It's interesting, isn't it? If someone asks us why we chose the career we are in, we usually have answer. It was practical. It was stable. It was a good opportunity. It made my parents proud. It was the safest option. But every now and then, usually during a quiet drive or while lying awake long after everyone else is asleep, another question appears. Not loudly, just gently. But if none of those reasons existed, would I still have chosen this? It's such an uncomfortable question because it isn't really about work, it's about authorship. Who has been writing your story? Most of us imagine life as a series of conscious decisions, but I wonder if it often looks more like a river. You don't wake up deciding where the river will go. The current simply keeps carrying you. School, college, career, marriage, children, mortgage, promotions, retirement. None of them were wrong. Many are beautiful. But somewhere along the way, it's possible to become so busy living that you never stop to ask whether this life feels like home inside your own heart. And perhaps that's why so many people feel guilty for feeling empty. Because from outside, everything looks fine. The career is respectable, the relationship looks stable, friends thinks you're successful, family thinks you have done well. Even you even tell yourself, I should be happy. Yet something inside keeps whispering, why doesn't any of this feel like mine? That feeling confuses people. They often think they are becoming ungrateful or selfish or difficult. Maybe they aren't. Maybe they are simply meeting themselves for the first time. One of the strangest things about growing up is that nobody hands up a map showing where adaptation ends and identity begins. So we keep adapting because adaptation works. It helps us belong, it helps us stay connected, it helps us avoid rejection. And belonging is one of the deepest human needs there is. Maybe even before we know who we are, we learn who we need to be to remain close to the people we love. I sometimes wonder how many adults are still living by rules they never consciously agreed to. Rules that sound like don't upset people, don't ask for too much. Success means security, keep everyone happy, don't waste your potential, be grateful, be sensible, good people sacrifice. Nobody may even say these words anymore, yet they continue speaking from somewhere inside us, almost as if they have become our own thoughts. And that's the fascinating thing about the mind. Not every thought that sound like yours begin with you. Some thoughts are inherited, some are absorbed, some are borrowed, and some were quickly planted year before you you knew you had a choice. Maybe that's why changing your life is rarely about changing your circumstances first. Sometimes it's about discovering which voice inside you has been making decision all along. Because there is a quite difference between living a life that fits and living a life that merely makes sense. Many of us become experts at making sense. Very few of us learn how to feel at home inside our own lives. Perhaps this is why there are moments that seems to arrive without warning: a birthday, an empty house after children moves away, a divorce, a new city, losing someone, burnout, a quiet Sunday afternoon. Nothing dramatic happens, and yet something shifts. You suddenly look at your own life almost as if you are seeing it from the outside, and a question appears that refuses to leave. If I could begin again, what would I choose? Not because the life you have built has no value, but because maybe for the very first time you are wondering whether you have been living from your deepest self, or from the version of yourself that simply learned how to survive. I don't think there is an easy answer to that question. Perhaps there isn't supposed to be. Maybe the question itself is where something new begins. There is something about childhood that we rarely think about. We often imagine childhood as the beginning of our personality, but perhaps it's also the beginning of our adaptations. Not because anyone intended to change us, not because our parent didn't love us. Sometimes they loved us deeply, sometimes they were doing the very best they could with what life had given them, and still we learned. Children are extraordinary observers. Long before they understand language, they understand atmosphere. They notice the silence after certain words. They notice the tension between two people sitting at the same dinner table. They notice the relief on parents' face when they are being good. They notice disappointment. They notice absence. They notice who receive affection and who doesn't. And they begin making conclusions, not with logic, with feeling. A child doesn't think my parents are emotionally unavailable because they carry unresolved grief. A child thinks maybe I'm asking for too much. A child doesn't think my father is struggled to express emotion because that's how he was raised. A child quietly wonders maybe emotion makes people uncomfortable. A child doesn't think my family is anxious because life has never felt secure. Instead, they slowly become anxious too. Not because anxiety was inherited genetically, sometimes because it was inherited emotionally. Children don't have the luxury of questioning the worlds they have been born into. For them, whatever happens repeatedly becomes normal. If criticism is constant, criticism becomes love. If achievement is the only thing celebrated, achievement begins to feel like worth. If affection disappears whenever conflict appears, peacekeeping starts feeling safer than honesty. None of these decisions are conscious, they are intelligent. They are beautiful, even because they help us connected to the people we depend on. And when you are little, connection isn't just important, it is survival. Maybe that's why some of us become the responsible one, the one everyone depends on, the one who never asks for help. Not because responsibility was our dream, but because somewhere very early it became our role. Perhaps you became the emotional caretaker in your family before you even understood your own emotions. Perhaps you became the peacemaker, the achiever, the invisible one, the funny one, the perfect child, the independent child who never needed anymore. If you have ever heard people say, I'm not sure that if you have ever heard like this, that you have always been so mature. I sometimes wonder whether that maturity was actually freedom or necessity. It's fascinating how these roles stay with us. The child who learned to avoid conflict may become the adult who apologize even when they have done nothing wrong. The child who learned love has to be earned maybe may become the adult who cannot rest without feeling guilty. The child who had to stay emotionally alert often becomes the adult who can relax everywhere except inside themselves. And because these ways of living have existed for so long, they stop feeling like adaptations. They begin feeling like personality. I have always been like this. Maybe, or maybe, you have simply been surviving in the same way for a very long time. Sometimes we say things about ourselves so casually. I'm just an overthinker. I'm just a people pleaser. I'm just independent. I'm just hard on myself. As though these qualities arrived fully formed. But what if each of them has a story? What if every habit has a history? Every fear has a beginning. Every pattern was once an answer to the question life asked of you. I wonder how many people spend years trying to fixing themselves without ever becoming curious about what their mind has been trying to protect. Because perhaps our mind isn't asking, how do I become perfect? Perhaps it is quietly asking, is it safe now to stop being who I had to become? That question changes everything because suddenly you are no longer at war with yourself. You're becoming curious about yourself. There is such a difference between saying, what's wrong with me, and asking, what happened that made this way of living feel necessary? One question creates shame, the other creates understanding. And maybe understanding is where change truly begins, not through force, not through becoming someone new, but through gently recognizing the reasons you became who you are. Because when we understand the wisdom inside our survival, we no longer have to hate it. We can simply thank it for carrying us this far. And then perhaps we can ask whether it still needs to carry us any further. There is something quietly hopeful about that because if so much of who we became was learned, then perhaps some of what no longer serves us can be unlearned. Not overnight, not peacefully, but gradually. The same way it was learned, our experience at a time, one relationship at a time, one honest moment at a time. Perhaps becoming yourself isn't about creating someone new. Perhaps it's about slowly meeting the person who was there before the world told you who you needed to be. I sometimes wonder how many versions of ourselves we carry, not because we are pretending, but because we are not because we are fake or pretending, but because human beings are remarkably good at becoming who they need to become. This version of you that your colleagues know, and another that your family knows, another that your closest friend knows, perhaps another that only exists when you are completely alone. None of these are necessarily dishonest. They are simply different part of being human. But every now and then a quiet question appears. Which one feels the most like me? It's uncomfortable question because of many people the answer doesn't come easily. No, not because there isn't a real self, but because the version that learned to survive has been speaking for so long. Then its voice now sound like your own. Maybe you have noticed it or something like that. And someone asks, what do you want? And for a moment, your mind goes completely blank. Not because you don't have an opinion, but because you have spent years asking a different question. What is expected of me? There is such a difference between these two questions. One leads to inward, and the other keeps looking outside. And if you have spent most of your life looking outside, it's understandable that looking inward feels unfamiliar. Sometimes people think losing yourself happens dramatically. I don't think it usually does. I think it happens quietly. One small compromise at a time. You laugh when Some things doesn't feel funny. You say yes because saying no feels uncomfortable. You stay because leaving feels selfish. And you achieve because slowing down feels dangerous. You keep smiling because no one knows what to do with your sadness. None of those moments seems significant on their own, but years later they become alive. Perhaps that's why so many people describe feeling disconnected without knowing why. They say, I don't even know who I am anymore, or I should be grateful, but something felt missing, or I don't know why I am unhappy. Nothing is actually wrong. Maybe nothing is wrong, maybe something has simply gone quiet. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to constantly manage how you are being perceived, to wonder whether you have a disappointed someone, whether you have said it wrong thing, whether everyone is okay with you, whether you have worked hard enough, whether you have achieved enough, whether you have become enough. It's almost like carrying an invisible audience with you all the day, even when no one else is there. I find that fascinating because eventually the people who once judged us aren't even in the room anymore, yet somehow their voices remain. You make a mistake and immediately something inside says you should have known better. You rest and another voice whisper you're wasting time. You dream about doing something different and suddenly don't be realistic, don't be unrealistic, try to be realistic. It's remarkable how certain voices they survive long after the moment they created them, that has created them. Sometimes we spend years believing those voices are wisdom, when perhaps they are simply echoes of teachers, parents, family expectations, old relationships, cultural ideas about success. Message absorbed so easily that we stop recognizing them as messages. They become reality for ourselves. And perhaps the hardest part isn't hearing those voices, it's believing they are you. Because once a voice feels like your own, you stop questioning it. You simply obey it. I wonder if that's why change can feel so frightening. Not because we dislike change, but because changing sometimes some things feel like disappointing invisible people. People who may not even expect those things from us anymore. Yet somehow we still carry the responsibility. There is another possibility, though, a quieter one. What if beneath all those expectations there has always been another part of you? The part that was curious before it became careful. The part that was playful before it became productive. The part that spoke before it learned to stay quiet. The part that rested before it learned that worth had to be earned. I don't believe that part disappears. I think it waits patiently, not demanding attention, simply wanting for moments when life becomes quiet enough for you to hear it again. Maybe that's why certain experiences affect us so deeply. Standing beside the sea, walking alone in the mountain, listening to music that seems to know something about us, reading a sentence that feels strangely familiar, meeting someone who sees us without asking us to perform. For a brief moment, we stop managing ourselves and something inside exhales. Not because our life has changed, but because we have remembered ourselves, even if only for a moment. Perhaps that's why so many of us are searching for not another achievement, not another title, not another version of ourselves. Perhaps we are searching for that feeling, the feeling of not having to become anyone. Because for a moment, who we already are feel enough. And maybe that's why the question, what if the life you are living isn't the life you choose, isn't really asking you to throw your life away. It's asking something much gentler. And that is, can you begin noticing the difference between the life built from fear and the life that is quietly feel like home? Maybe the answer won't arrive today, maybe it doesn't need to. Sometimes the beginning isn't finding an answer, sometimes the beginning is simply realizing that you have been asking the wrong question all along. There are moments in life that don't look important from the outside. No celebration, no tragedy, no announcement, nothing that anyone else would notice, and yet something changes. Maybe you have experienced one. You are driving home after another ordinary day, the same road you have taken hundred of times, the same traffic, the same songs, and suddenly, for no obvious reason, you feel strangely disconnected from your own life, almost as if you were watching someone else's routine. Or or perhaps you're sitting with friends, everyone is laughing, the conversation is flowing, you are smiling, you are participating, and still there is this quiet feeling inside. Not loneliness exactly, something harder to describe, as though you are present but not fully there. Sometimes these moments arrive after loss, sometimes after becoming a parent, sometimes after your children leave home, sometimes after a divorce, sometimes after illness, at times after burnout. But what fascinates me even more is that they also arrive after success, after getting everything you once believed you would finally make you feel complete. The promotion, the house, the relationship, the degree, the recognition, the financial security. You reach the place you have been climbing towards for years. You stand there, you look around, and quietly, almost guilty, and wonder, why doesn't this feel like the way I imagined? That can be a frightening, though, thought, because we are taught that if we work hard enough, one day we'll arrive. We'll finally feel settled, confident, whole, certain. So, so when those feelings don't disappear, many people don't question the destination, they question themselves. Maybe something is wrong with me. Why can't I just be happy? Other people would be grateful, but perhaps the emptiness isn't a sign that you have failed. It's a sign, it's an invitation not to abandon your life, not to become curious about the ex life you have been building. I have often wondered whether we spend the first half of our life learning how to become someone and the second half learning how to let go of who we thought we had to be. Not everyone reaches that second journey, not because they can't, but because it's uncomfortable. It's ask question with no easy answer. Question like, if I stop trying to be who everyone expects, who am I? That question has no quick solution, and maybe that's why we avoid it. We stay busy, very busy, and not because we love being busy. Sometimes because silence asks question that noise allows us to postpone. Have you ever noticed how difficult silence has become? The moment we are alone, we reach to our phone, we play something in the background, we scroll, and we answer emails, we clean, we plan, we organize, we stay occupied. None of these things are wrong, but I sometimes wonder whether busyness has become one of the safest way to avoid meetings, meeting ourselves. Because when life finally becomes quiet, something long forgotten often begin speaking, not loudly, almost like a whisper, a memory, a longing, a sadness that never quite had the chance to be felt, a dream that quietly stepped aside years ago because there were bills to pay, expectations to meet, responsibilities to carry. It doesn't return demanding that you change everything. It simply asks, do you remember me? I find that question incredibly moving because perhaps inside every adult there are part of themselves that has been waiting very patiently, not angrily, not in a resentful manner, just patiently waiting for the day they might finally be noticed. Maybe that's why certain moments stop us in our tracks. Watching your child do something you were never allowed to do, hearing someone speak with a freedom you secretly admire, reading a sentence that feels as though someone has somehow put words to something you have carried your whole life, standing in nature and suddenly feeling more like yourself than you have in months, listening to a piece of music that brings tears without you knowing why. These moments aren't random, they they often reveal something, not about what is missing in your life, but about what has been missing from your relationship with yourself. And perhaps that's one of the gentlest truth we can hold. Not every ache inside us is asking for a new life. Sometimes it's asking for a more honest relationship with the one we are already living. Because there is a difference. You can change countries and still carry the same fears. Change career and still abandon yourself. Leave one relationship and recreate the same emotional pattern in another. External change is sometimes necessary, but it doesn't automatically become inner change. The place change, the person carrying the story often doesn't. Which is why I don't think the deepest question is, should I change my life? I think it's basically that, from which part of myself have I been living? Have I been living from fear or freedom, from obligation or meaning, from proving, or from simply being? Perhaps those aren't questions to answer today. Perhaps they are questions to live with, to let them quietly accompany you over the coming weeks. Because the most important question is that life rarely demand immediate answer. They ask for honest attention. And maybe, just maybe, the moment you begin asking different questions, your life has already begun changing, not on the outside, but in the place where every meaningful change began within. There's a sentence I keep coming back to: we don't always choose our first life. Sometimes our first life chooses us. It is shaped by where we were born, the family that raised us, the fear that surrounded us, the love we received, the love we longed for, the opportunities we had, the opportunities we never had. None of these were choices, they become the landscape we learn to walk through. But perhaps there comes a day, different for everyone, when life quietly asks a new question. Now that you can choose, will you? I don't think this question arrives with firework. It arrives while folding laundry, driving to work, looking out of a window, watching your child sleep, walking your dog, waiting in an airport, sitting alone after everyone has gone to bed. Life rarely interrupts us dramatically, it whispers. The difficulty is our lives become so familiar that familiarity begin to feel like truth. Just because you have lived a certain way for 20 years doesn't necessarily mean it's who you are. It simply means it's who you have practiced being. There's a difference, a profound difference, I must say. Think about that for a moment. We became that we repeatedly practice. If every day you practice ignoring your own needs, it begins to feel natural. If every day you have practiced putting everyone else first, that begins to feel like kindness. If every day you have practiced earning your worth, rest begin to feel uncomfortable. Practice eventually become identity, not because it truly is, but because the brain mistakes familiarity for self. Maybe that's why change feels so strange, not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. And the unfamiliar often feels unsafe, even when it is healthier. I've often wondered how many people mistake anxiety for intuition, or guilt for responsibility, or exhaustion for achievement, or emotional numbness for maturity. Sometimes what feels normal is simply what has been repeated long enough. Awareness changes something extraordinary. It doesn't immediately change your life, it changes the observer. And once the observer changes, everything begins to look different. You begin noticing pattern you have never noticed before. You hear certain sentences differently. You become aware of how often you apologize, and how often you minimize yourself, how often you abandon what your body is quietly trying to tell you. Nothing has changed, and yet everything has, because now you are awake. Perhaps awakening isn't becoming a different person, perhaps it's finally noticing the person who has been living underneath all the adaptation, waiting not to replace your life but to participate in it. I think that's one of the most beautiful possibilities of being human, that no matter how old we are, life is still allows us another conversation with ourselves. At 20, at 40, at 65, even at 80, there is still something inside capable of asking, what feels true now? Not 10 years ago, not according to someone else's expectations. Now, today, this version of me. Because perhaps authenticity isn't something we discover once, perhaps it's relationship we keep returning to for the rest of our life. There is another perspective too. There's a, I mean, the grief of the life you never lived. I don't think we talk enough about grief. Not just the grief of losing people, but the grief of losing possibilities, the lives we almost lived, the conversations we never had, the dreams we quietly packed away because they don't seem practical, the version of ourselves that slowly becomes stranger. Sometimes grief doesn't arrive after a funeral, sometimes it's arrive on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. You're looking through old photographs, you hear a song you haven't heard in years, you find an old notebook, you remember something you once wanted with your whole heart, and for just a moment, you meet a younger version of yourself, not the younger version everyone remembers, the one only you remember, the one who believed certain things were still possible. And maybe that's when a strange sadness appears, not because life has been bad, but because you suddenly realize how much of yourself has been negotiated away little by little without even noticing. There is something profoundly human about this. We often think identity is something we build, but perhaps identity is also something we slowly abandon, not all at once, one compromise at a time. I'll do it later at a time. One isn't the right time at a time until one day. So you can no longer remember when later become never. I sometimes think that about how easily we measure success. Titles, incomes, achievement, followers, qualification, promotion, recognition, none of those are meaningless. They can bring purpose, stability, joy. But I wonder, what if there were another way of measuring a life? Not by asking how much did I accomplish, but how much of myself was present while I was accomplishing it. Because those are not always the same things. You can build an extraordinary life while quietly disappearing inside it. Perhaps this is why some people reach everything they once wanted and still feel as though they are standing outside their own existence. Not because success is empty, but because success cannot answer questions it was never designed to answer. No achievement can tell you who you are. No applause can replace your inner peace. No amount of external validation can permanently quiet a life that has never really felt like its own. There's another kind of grief that almost no one prepares us for. the grief of recognizing that some of our choices were never entirely ours. That can be unsettling, I can understand. Perhaps many of you have felt it. Because the mind immediately wants to look for someone to blame: parents, culture, society, relationships, circumstances. Sometimes there is real pain there, sometimes real harm, but blame rarely gives us back ourselves. Understanding often does. Maybe our parents also inherited lives they didn't fully choose. Maybe they too learned to survive. Maybe the expectation they passed on were once expectations placed upon them. Perhaps what traveled through generations wasn't intention, it was adaptation. Not because anyone wanted suffering to continue, but because unexamined patterns often continue quietly until someone becomes curious enough to notice them. Maybe that's why awareness feels so significant, not because it changes yesterday, but because it changes what tomorrow is allowed to become. I think one of the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is to stop asking, why didn't I know this sooner? You couldn't have. We see our life through the understanding we have at the time, not through the understanding we gain years later. Looking back always makes things seem obvious. Looking forward never does. Perhaps every version of you was simply trying to create the best life it knew how to create. The 21-year-old you, the 31-year-old you, the frightened child inside you, the exhausted adult, the hopeful dreamer. None of them were trying to ruin your life. They were trying to protect it, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes beautifully, but always with the understanding they had in that moment. There's something deeply compassionate about seeing yourself that way, not as a collection of mistakes, but as a collection of adaptation. Some is still helpful, some no longer necessary, all understandable. I often wonder whether healing is less about becoming someone new and more about ending the war with the person who got you here. Imagine how much energy we have spent trying to find ourselves, to silence part of ourselves, to shame ourselves into changing, to become worthy enough. Perhaps healing begins when the fight becomes a conversation, when judgment becomes curiosity, when criticism becomes understanding. Maybe that's what it meant to come home to yourself, not arriving somewhere you have never been, but finally opening the door to a place inside you that has been waiting without resentment, without accusations, simply waiting. And perhaps this is one of the most courageous journey a human being can take, not across countries, not across careers, but across the distance between the person they learn to be and the person they have quietly been all along. I don't know what your life looks like as you're listening to this. Maybe you're driving somewhere, maybe you're making dinner, maybe you're walking, maybe you're lying awake because your mind won't let you sleep, or maybe today feels exactly like every other day. But if there is one thing I hope this conversation leaves with you, it's not a new decision, it's a new relationship with your own questions. We live in a world that celebrates certainty. People admire those who seems to know exactly what they are doing, exactly where they are going, exactly who they are. But I wonder if certainty is something overrated. Because certainty can also become a prison. It can stop us asking questions that might completely change the way we experience ourselves. Perhaps there is something quietly courageous about saying, I'm no longer completely certain that the life I have been living is entirely mine. Not because you suddenly reject it, but because you are willing to become curious about it. Curiosity is such an underestimated quality. Children have it naturally. Somewhere along the way, many of us replace curiosity with judgment. Instead of asking, why do I react this way? We ask, what's wrong with me? Instead of wondering, what does this feeling want me to notice? We rush to get rid of it. Instead of listening, we correct. Instead of understanding, we improve. And maybe this is why so many people spend years trying to become better without ever feeling more like themselves. I think there is a profound difference between changing yourself and meeting yourself. One is driven by dissatisfaction, the other by presence. One keeps saying, become someone else, the other gently asks, who have you been all this time? Maybe that is the real work, not becoming extraordinary, not becoming fearless, not becoming endlessly confident, but simply becoming more honest. Honest enough to notice when you are saying yes while your whole body is saying no. Honest enough to admit that success doesn't always feel meaningful. Honest enough to acknowledge that sometimes you have confused being needed with being loved or being admired or being known or being productive with being valuable. Those are those are easy mistakes to make. Most of us were taught those equations long before we had the language to question them. That's where the real choice begins, not in a dramatic moment, but in ordinary ones. The pause before saying yes, the courage to say, actually, I don't think that's what I want. The willingness to rest without apologizing for it. The decision to tell someone how you really feel. Those moments rarely make headlines, but they quietly change life. There's one image that keeps coming to my mind. Imagine you have been reading a book your entire life for years. You believed someone else was writing every page, your family, your circumstances, your fears, your past, your culture, your survival, and then one ordinary day you notice something. The pen is still in your hand. Maybe it's always has been, not at the beginning. At the beginning, you couldn't choose. Children don't write the opening chapter of their lives, they inherit them. They adapt to them, they survive them, but somewhere, often much later than we expect, the pen quietly finds its ways into our hand. The tragedy isn't that the first chapter were written without our permission. The tragedy is believing we can never write another one. So perhaps after today's conversation, don't trust to rewrite your entire life. That isn't the invitation. The invitation is much smaller and perhaps much more difficult. Just notice which choices leave you feeling more alive. Notice which conversation leaves you feeling smaller. Notice when your body relaxes. Notice when it quietly contracts. Notice the old voices. Simply so you recognize that they are voices, not truth. Maybe this week there won't be dramatic transformation. Maybe there'll be only one moment, one conversation, one boundary, one decision that comes from the person you are becoming rather than the person you once had to be. Sometimes this is how an entirely different life begins, not all at once, but one conscious choice at a time. And perhaps years from now, you won't remember this episode because it gives you answer. Maybe you'll remember it because for a little while it gave you permission to ask yourself different question. And sometimes a different question is the beginning of a different life. This has been from the therapy room, psychology of mind and body. And if you find these conversations meaningful, if something in today's conversation resonated with you, don't rush to move on. Sit with it, journal about it, talk to someone you trust, notice what emotions surface while you were listening. Please share this episode with someone who might quietly need it, because so many people live inside this pattern silently. And if you enjoy psychologically deep therapy room style conversation around healing, relationship, trauma, anxiety, attachment, and emotional well being, follow the podcast on YouTube and Spotify. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, be gentle with yourself, not because you're fragile, but because you have been carrying stories that began long before you had the chance to choose them. And perhaps new, little by little, you can begin choosing what comes next. See you next time. I'll be sitting next besides to you. Take care.